It was a sweltering afternoon in the bustling streets of Atlanta, the sun beating down relentlessly on the city, casting long shadows across the pavement. FBI Special Agent Tara Johnson, a brilliant, highly respected black woman, was behind the wheel of her car, navigating her way back to the office after what had been another grueling day. For months, she had been neck-deep in a high-profile investigation, meticulously piecing together the operations of a dangerous drug cartel that had left a trail of violence and chaos in its wake. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Now, finally, after countless hours of chasing leads and breaking through barriers, she was close to cracking the case wide open. Her body was weary from the long hours, the pressure weighing heavily on her shoulders, but underneath the exhaustion, she felt a deep sense of pride. She had worked hard to earn her place in the FBI, overcoming the challenges that came with being one of the few black women in a predominantly white, male-dominated agency. It had not been easy, but she was determined to prove her worth every step of the way. As she drove through the familiar streets of Atlanta, the hum of the city around her, Tara's mind was already racing with the latest details of the case. Every clue, every piece of intel was swirling in her head as she tried to put the puzzle together, inching closer to that breakthrough moment. Just as she was deep in thought, something caught her eye. In the rearview mirror, flashing blue lights appeared, rapidly closing in on her. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced down at the speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Confused, she signaled and carefully pulled her car over to the side of the road, her mind racing with questions. What had she done wrong? The police car came to a halt behind her, its lights still flashing. Tara watched in her side mirror as the officer, a tall, white man with a stern expression, stepped out of his car. His hand rested on the holster of his gun as he approached her vehicle. She instinctively kept calm, reminding herself of the countless situations she had been trained to handle. Rolling down her window, she prepared to explain who she was. After all, she was a federal agent on official duty. This was likely just a misunderstanding. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Tara asked, her voice steady, holding her FBI badge in her hand, ready to defuse the situation. The officer, whose name badge read Daniels, barely looked at her as he barked, "License and registration." His tone was cold and dismissive, and he did not acknowledge her greeting. Tara frowned, momentarily caught off guard by his abruptness. She had encountered difficult officers before, but something about Daniel's demeanor felt different, an air of hostility that made her uneasy. Maintaining her composure, she responded, "I'm an FBI agent. Here's my badge," extending it toward him for a closer look. Officer Daniels gave it only a cursory glance, his frown deepening. "I said license and registration," he repeated, this time more forcefully, completely disregarding her badge. A chill ran down Tara's spine as alarm bells began to go off in her mind. This wasn't right. She had made it clear who she was and why she was there, yet Daniel seemed intent on ignoring her authority. "Officer, I'm on official duty," she reiterated, her voice calm but firm, trying to avoid escalating the tension. However, Daniels didn't seem to care. His eyes narrowed as he spoke again, this time his voice laced with irritation. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone now openly aggressive. Tara blinked, shocked by the sudden escalation. "Excuse me?" she asked, incredulous. Daniel's face hardened, his voice rising in volume. "Are you deaf? I said step out of the vehicle." He practically yelled the command, drawing the attention of passers-by. The once ordinary traffic stop was quickly becoming a public spectacle. Tara felt the weight of onlookers' eyes on her as they slowed their pace, whispering among themselves, watching the scene unfold. Tara hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She knew her rights, and she knew this stop was unjustified. There was no legitimate reason for her to be pulled over, let alone forced to exit her vehicle. But she could sense the situation spiraling out of control, the racial undertones now glaringly apparent. She had been trained to handle high-stress situations, but this felt different. The power dynamic was shifting, and it wasn't in her favor. "Officer, I am complying with your request," she said, trying once more to reason with him. "But I need you to understand that I am an FBI agent, and I'm on official duty." Her voice remained steady, though internally, her frustration and fear were mounting. Daniel's expression twisted with disdain as he leaned in closer to her window. His voice was low, dripping with contempt. "I don't care if you're the president. Step out of the vehicle, or I'll drag you out myself." Tara's stomach churned with anxiety. Slowly, she opened her car door and stepped out, her hands visible at all times. The crowd of bystanders had grown larger now, their murmurs filling the tense silence as they watched the situation escalate. Daniels moved toward her, and before she could utter another word, he grabbed her arm roughly and slammed her against the side of her car. "Hey, what are you doing?" Tara's voice cracked with disbelief as the pain shot through her arm. "Resisting arrest, huh?" Daniels sneered, his grip tightening as he twisted her arm behind her back, snapping the cold steel handcuffs onto her wrists. "You think you can flash a badge and get away with whatever you want?" If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Tara winced as the cuffs dug into her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest, disbelief mingling with rage. This was no longer just an abuse of power. It was an attack on her dignity, her position, and her identity as a black woman in law enforcement. She couldn't believe this was happening, to be treated like a criminal when she was the one upholding the law. The humiliation was unbearable, but more than that, the stark realization of how little her authority mattered to this man sent waves of anger and fear coursing through her veins. All the while, the crowd looked on, but no one stepped in to help. The crowd surrounding the scene had grown larger, and more people were openly staring, some even raising their phones to record the escalating situation. Tara could feel the weight of their gazes on her, and her face burned, not only from the anger that was rising like a tidal wave inside her, but also from the intense embarrassment. She could see the judgment in some eyes and curiosity in others, but no one intervened. Despite the tightness in her chest, Tara refused to let herself crumble under the pressure. She stood tall, her posture stiff with resolve. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, and she wasn't about to let this bigoted officer destroy her dignity. "Officer Daniels, you're making a mistake," Tara said, her voice firm despite the tremble that hinted at the fury bubbling beneath the surface. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she tried to keep her emotions in check. She had faced intense situations before, but this was different. This was raw. This was personal. "Shut your mouth," Daniels barked, his eyes narrowing. His face was twisted with disdain, and his voice was laced with venom. "You think you're better than everyone else just because you work for the FBI? Let me tell you something. You're not above the law." The sneer in his tone was unmistakable, as if her being part of the FBI was more of an insult to him than a fact. His hand tightened on her arm, and she could feel the malice radiating off him. Tara's heart raced. She knew she had to stay calm, but her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the chaos around her. She had never expected something like this, to be detained, harassed, and manhandled by a fellow law enforcement officer. Not while she was on duty. She thought of her colleagues at the FBI. Would they even believe her when she told them what was happening? Arrested by a racist cop for no reason? It sounded like something out of a nightmare. Daniels gripped her arm tighter, dragging her towards his patrol car as she stumbled to keep up. Every attempt she made to reason with him fell on deaf ears. He was hell-bent on asserting his dominance, and nothing she said would change his mind. As he roughly shoved her into the back seat of his car, Tara caught a glimpse of the bystanders filming. Their expressions were a mix of shock and uncertainty. Some murmured to each other, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but none of them stepped forward. No one dared challenge the officer's actions. Their silence stung as much as the officer's abuse of power. As the car door slammed shut, Tara inhaled deeply, trying to regain her composure. She had been in countless dangerous situations throughout her career, but this was different. This wasn't just about an arrest. It felt like an attack on her identity, on everything she represented. Daniels had crossed a line, and she knew she couldn't let this go unchallenged. But she had to be smart about it. Losing her temper would only give him what he wanted, a reason to further escalate the situation. No, she had to be strategic. Should she call for backup? File a formal complaint? The options ran through her mind like rapid fire, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't afford to stay silent. Not this time. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Tara's thoughts raced alongside the passing scenery. The adrenaline was still surging through her veins, her pulse quickening with each second that ticked by. Her wrists throbbed from the pressure of the too tight handcuffs, the cold metal biting into her skin. She flexed her fingers, trying to alleviate some of the discomfort, but it was futile. Daniels had cuffed her with malicious intent, and the pain only fueled her determination. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror where Daniels' eyes briefly met hers. He wore a smirk that made her stomach churn. He was enjoying this, enjoying the power trip, the humiliation. "You thought you could get away with pretending to be FBI, didn't you?" he taunted, his voice thick with arrogance. Tara's jaw tightened. "I'm not pretending," she replied, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "I am a federal agent, and you're making a huge mistake." She spoke with authority, but inside, the rage was building like a storm, threatening to consume her. Daniels let out a derisive chuckle, shaking his head. "Sure you are," he said mockingly, "and I'm the chief of police." His tone dripped with condescension, as if her credentials were nothing more than a joke to him. Tara bit the inside of her cheek, willing herself not to react. There was no point in arguing with him now. It was clear that reasoning with Daniels would get her nowhere. He had already decided that she was guilty of something. What? She wasn't sure, but he seemed determined to punish her for it. After what felt like an eternity, the patrol car came to a stop in front of a small, run-down police station on the outskirts of the city. This wasn't the precinct she was familiar with. It was old, neglected, and far away from the bustling city center where she typically operated. Her stomach sank as the realization hit her. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. Daniels had deliberately taken her to a remote location, far from the eyes of her colleagues at the FBI, far from anyone who might challenge his actions. The car door swung open, and Daniels yanked her out with a rough grip. "Let's go, agent," he sneered, emphasizing the word agent like it was a bad joke. His contempt was palpable. Tara winced as he shoved her towards the entrance of the dilapidated station. The anger inside her was boiling over now, but she knew she had to keep it in check. She couldn't afford to let her emotions get the best of her. Not here. Not now. As they walked, she thought about everything she had been through to get to this point in her career. All the late nights, the grueling training, the dangerous field operations. She had proven herself time and time again, but none of that seemed to matter in this moment. To Daniels, she was just a black woman, and that was enough for him to treat her like she was less than human. Inside the station, the walls were yellowed with age, the air stale and oppressive. Daniels pushed her forward, his grip still firm on her arm. She looked around, noting the absence of other officers. It was eerily quiet, as if the station itself had been abandoned. This was no ordinary arrest. Tara knew she had stepped into something far more sinister. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, but she wouldn't give Daniels the satisfaction of seeing her break. Inside the station, an unsettling silence hung in the air. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of dread as Daniels led Tara past the front desk. The few officers present barely registered their presence, their indifference to Tara's situation almost palpable. Their lack of reaction spoke volumes. This wasn't an unusual scene for them, and Daniel's behavior seemed to be almost routine. It struck Tara as profoundly chilling. The realization dawned on her with a stark clarity. No one was going to come to her aid. She was completely alone. Daniels propelled her into a cramped interrogation room and slammed the door with a forceful bang that echoed off the walls. The room was bathed in a dim, harsh light that cast eerie shadows. It contained nothing but a small metal table and two metal chairs, one of which Daniels shoved her into. He left her restrained with handcuffs, showing no concern for her comfort or rights. "Let me make one thing clear," Daniels began, his tone dripping with menace as he began to pace back and forth in front of her. "I don't give a damn who you claim to be. As far as I'm concerned, you're just another criminal trying to pull a fast one on me." Tara fixed him with a steely glare, refusing to show any sign of intimidation. "You're violating my rights. You have no justification for holding me, and believe me, when this is over, you will regret this." Daniels stopped his pacing abruptly and leaned in close, his face inches from hers. His voice dropped to a low, menacing whisper. "Is that a threat, Agent?" he growled. Tara didn't flinch. "It's a promise," she replied firmly. For a moment, Daniels stared at her, and then a bitter, mirthless laugh escaped him. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? Flashing that badge around like it means something. Let me tell you something. You're in my territory now." The tension in the room was palpable, but Tara remained composed, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. "I've faced worse threats than you, Officer Daniels. You won't get away with this." Daniels straightened up, a smirk playing on his lips as he turned to leave. "We'll see about that," he muttered, his voice laced with disdain, before walking out and leaving her alone in the room. As the door clicked shut behind him, Tara let out a slow, measured breath. The reality of her isolation sank in. She needed to find a way to contact her team. The realization that she couldn't depend on anyone within the station was now crystal clear. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Daniels was intent on keeping her isolated. Her mind raced as she considered her options. There had to be a way to turn the situation around and regain control. She scanned the room for anything that could assist her escape. There was a small window high up on the wall, but it was too out of reach to be of any use. The door was locked from the outside, and with her hands cuffed, accessing her badge, which was still tucked away in her jacket pocket, was impossible. Minutes ticked by, each one adding to her mounting frustration. Tara was accustomed to being in control, orchestrating events, making arrests, never in this vulnerable position. The dynamics had shifted dramatically, and she needed to regain the upper hand. Suddenly, the door swung open again, this time admitting a younger officer who appeared to be in his early 30s. He had a nervous expression, and his demeanor was noticeably different from Daniels. He seemed less confident, more hesitant. He glanced at Tara, and then at the file he held in his hand before speaking. "Agent Johnson," he began, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I'm Officer Mitchell. I've been assigned to process you for holding, but I want to apologize for what's happening." Tara looked at him with a mix of surprise and hope. His voice lacked the hostility she had come to expect from Daniels. There was a chance, however slim, that he might be sympathetic. Before she could respond, Daniels reappeared in the doorway, his expression darkening as he shot a venomous glare at Mitchell. "What are you waiting for? Get her processed." Daniels snapped, his voice laced with contempt. Mitchell hesitated, his discomfort evident, but he nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir." Daniels lingered for a moment longer, casting a final scornful glance at both Tara and Mitchell before turning and exiting the room. Tara's eyes locked with Mitchell's, and she felt a glimmer of hope. He might be her key to navigating this dire situation. As Officer Mitchell shuffled awkwardly and pulled out a small notebook, Tara watched him with a mix of hope and wariness. He seemed uneasy, maybe even sympathetic, but she knew better than to fully trust anyone in her current predicament. People in his position often faltered under pressure, especially with someone like Daniels looming over them. Still, she couldn't afford to let any potential opportunity slip by. Mitchell cleared his throat nervously as he flipped open his notebook. "I'm going to need some basic information," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's just routine, name, date of birth, and so on." Tara observed Mitchell with intense scrutiny. His unease was palpable, reflected in the way his eyes incessantly flicked toward the door, as if he anticipated Daniels to burst in at any second, interrupting their conversation. "You're already aware of my identity," she said, her voice calm yet unyielding. "What you're involved in here isn't just questionable, it's morally wrong, and you know it." Mitchell's hand stilled mid-scribble, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes locked. In that brief exchange, Tara caught a glimpse of something, perhaps guilt or apprehension, in his gaze, but it was swiftly veiled by a facade of professional detachment. He looked down at his notepad again, his avoidance of her piercing gaze evident. "I don't make the rules," he muttered, almost as if trying to convince himself more than her. Tara leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a resolute whisper. You may not set the rules, but you have the power to choose whether or not to follow directives that you know are fundamentally wrong. Mitchell hesitated once more, the pin quivering in his grasp. The tension in the confined interrogation room was almost tangible, and it was clear he was grappling with an internal struggle. Tara, having navigated many high-pressure scenarios, could read the signs of someone wrestling with their conscience. I can assist you, Mitchell, she continued, her tone softening, yet still carrying an undertone of urgency, but only if you're willing to assist me first. Mitchell glanced around nervously, his eyes darting between Tara and the door, as if seeking an escape. He exhaled heavily, running a hand through his disheveled hair, a gesture of frustration or resignation. This isn't how this should be happening, he murmured almost to himself. I know something isn't right, but Daniels is the senior officer. I can't just recognize that Daniels is misusing his authority. Tara interjected sharply, her voice cutting through his uncertainty. You've witnessed it. You're aware of it. If you don't act now, you'll be complicit. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of Tara's words settling heavily upon him. He looked visibly conflicted, his face a canvas of turmoil. He opened his mouth to reply, but before he could articulate his response, the door to the interrogation room burst open. Daniels stormed in, his expression hardened with anger. What's taking so long? He demanded, his voice abrasive. She's a straightforward case, not a complex puzzle to solve. Mitchell sprang to his feet, his words stumbling over each other. I was just gathering the necessary information, sir. Daniel's sneer was one of derision, clearly unimpressed with Mitchell's performance. Get her into holding already. We don't have all day. Mitchell nodded hurriedly, shoving his notepad back into his pocket. He averted his gaze from Tara as he stood, signaling for her to follow him. But Tara wasn't finished. She recognized this might be her last opportunity to reach him, and she wasn't going to let fear or intimidation silence her. Officer Daniels, you're making a grave mistake, Tara said, her voice steady and authoritative. This decision will come back to haunt you. I assure you of that. Daniels let out a harsh, bitter laugh that reverberated off the sterile walls. Oh, I'm sure you believe that, sweetheart, he retorted scornfully, but in this town, no one gives a damn about your so-called authority. Just because you flash an FBI badge doesn't make you untouchable. Think again. Tara held his gaze unflinchingly, her resolve unwavering. I'm not here to win your approval, Daniels. I'm here to do my job, and believe me, those who do care about justice will be coming for you. For a fleeting moment, a shadow of uncertainty crossed Daniels' face, but it was quickly replaced by his usual veneer of smug arrogance. He waved his hand dismissively at Mitchell. Get her out of my sight, he snapped, his tone final and commanding. Mitchell, visibly shaken and tense, took a step forward and gripped Tara's arm with a firm yet unsteady hand. He guided her out of the room, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above casting eerie shadows on the narrow hallway. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Tara could feel the weight of Mitchell's internal struggle pressing down on them both. Despite his evident distress, he maintained a stony silence, his expression unreadable. They arrived at the end of the corridor where a small, austere holding cell awaited. Mitchell fumbled with a set of keys, his movements hurried and anxious. He unlocked the cell door and, with a subtle nod, gestured for her to enter. Tara halted just outside the cell, her gaze steady and piercing as she looked directly at Mitchell. You still have a choice, she said, her voice a calm whisper that carried an undertone of urgency. Her eyes locked onto his, conveying a silent plea for him to reconsider. You don't have to go along with this. Mitchell's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders sagging in defeat. He mumbled something under his breath, his words so faint that they were lost to the echo of the empty hallway. Without meeting her eyes again, he closed the cell door with a decisive clang and walked away, his footsteps receding into the distance. Inside the cell, Tara sank onto the small, unyielding bench, the chill of the metal seeping through her clothes. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The oppressive walls of the cell seemed to close in on her, but she fought against the encroaching panic. She knew that succumbing to fear would be her undoing. She had to remain composed and clear-headed to navigate the dire situation. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As the hours dragged on, each minute seemed like an eternity, stretching her patience and endurance to their limits. Alone with her thoughts, Tara's frustration and anger simmered beneath the surface. Her predicament was not just about personal freedom. It was a battle against the deep-seated injustices that had ensnared her: blatant racism, the abuse of authority, and the public degradation she had suffered. The indignation burned fiercely within her, fueling her resolve. Suddenly, the distant sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, causing Tara to stiffen. She held her breath, wondering who was coming. To her surprise, it was Mitchell who appeared at the door of her cell, his face a mask of apprehension. He glanced around nervously, ensuring they were not observed, before swiftly unlocking the cell door. Tara's heart leaped as Mitchell made a subtle gesture for her to follow. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice tinged with confusion and disbelief. Her eyes searched his for answers. Mitchell's face was pale, his anxiety palpable as he stole a glance over his shoulder. "I'm getting you out of here," he said in a hushed, urgent tone. "But we don't have much time." Tara hesitated, torn between skepticism and hope. The idea of trusting him seemed fraught with risk, but the lack of alternatives left her with little choice. If there was even a glimmer of sincerity in his offer, she had to seize it. She took a deep breath and, without further hesitation, followed him. They moved swiftly through the dimly lit precinct, their footsteps muffled by the shadows. Mitchell led her through a series of back hallways, carefully avoiding the more populated areas where other officers might be present. Tara's pulse quickened as they approached the back exit. Mitchell paused at the door, producing a new set of keys with trembling hands and unlocking it with a decisive click. "This is your chance," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes were filled with a mix of fear and determination as he looked at her. "Get out before Daniels figures out what's happening." Tara stood by the exit, her mind racing with uncertainty. Could she trust him, or was this some elaborate trap? The night air crept through the small gap in the door, sending a shiver down her spine. The ordeal she had endured had been a waking nightmare, and it was difficult to believe that anyone within the precinct could genuinely be on her side. Yet, faced with the choice of staying or taking a chance, she chose to step into the unknown. Mitchell's gaze flicked anxiously to his watch, the edges of his worry etched deeply into his features. "We don't have much time," he urged in a tense whisper. His voice betrayed his anxiety, and his eyes darted around the room as if he were expecting Daniels to burst through the door at any moment. Tara took a deep breath, steadying herself despite the turmoil inside. She was painfully aware that staying put was no longer an option, especially after what Daniels had done. Yet, running now could only escalate her predicament. As an FBI agent, her disappearance from a police station would inevitably attract unwanted scrutiny and questions. Caught in a desperate bind, she was forced to confront the betrayal from the very system she had dedicated her life to. Now, every decision carried monumental weight, and time was slipping through her fingers. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice steady but laced with frustration and fear. Mitchell's response was delayed. He opened his mouth to speak, but then shut it, his expression a maelstrom of internal conflict. His eyes revealed a mixture of guilt and desperation that he struggled to mask. "Because it's wrong," he finally murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "What Daniels is doing, it's not just morally wrong, it's illegal. He's going to face consequences, one way or another. But if you stay here, you're the one who's going to end up paying the price. You have to leave before it's too late." Tara scrutinized him closely, searching for signs of deceit in his eyes, the urgency of his plea. His earnestness seemed genuine, but her instincts told her to remain wary. In a situation so fraught with peril, distinguishing truth from manipulation was a luxury she could scarcely afford. The ticking clock added an almost palpable pressure, forcing her to make a decision quickly. If Mitchell's words held any truth, remaining in the station would only worsen her situation. If Daniels returned and found her still confined, there was no predicting what further dangers he might unleash. Tara knew all too well the danger posed by a man like Daniels, someone driven by a toxic blend of authority and animosity. Choosing to trust him, albeit reluctantly, she nodded and took a decisive step toward the door. "All right," she whispered, her voice firm despite the uncertainty. "Let's go." A look of relief washed over Mitchell's face, and he hurriedly guided her outside. The crisp night air hit her with an invigorating chill, offering a brief respite from the oppressive tension she had been under. For the first time in hours, she felt a faint glimmer of hope as they moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows while navigating the back alley behind the precinct. Tara's senses were on high alert, each sound, a rustling leaf, a distant footstep, heightening her anxiety. Trained for high-stakes situations, she was nonetheless unnerved by the realization that the threat now came from those sworn to uphold the law. The constant threat of Daniels catching up was a chilling reality. Mitchell led her to a dilapidated car parked at the end of the alley, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with his keys. After a moment of anxious searching, he managed to unlock the passenger door. "Get in," he whispered urgently, his eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. Tara slid into the car, her vigilance unwavering as she scanned the area for potential threats. Mitchell quickly took his place behind the wheel, starting the engine with a low rumble that seemed disproportionately loud in the quiet night. As they pulled away from the precinct, the tension inside the car was palpable, an oppressive silence enveloping them. Tara's unease deepened with every passing moment. Though they were no longer inside the precinct, their safety was far from assured. Daniels was not the type to let such a transgression go unchallenged. His need for control would only make him more dangerous. Breaking the silence, Tara finally spoke. "Where are we going?" Mitchell's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white against the darkness. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he assured her, his voice resolute. "Someplace where Daniels won't be able to find you." Tara raised an eyebrow, her skepticism resurfacing. "And then what? I can't just vanish, you know? I need to address this issue head-on." Mitchell stole a glance at her, his face taut with concern. "I understand, but you need time. Time to plan your next move, time to gather the evidence you need against him. If you stay in the city, Daniels will bury you before you even have a chance to fight back." Tara reclined in her seat, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. The notion of fleeing unsettled her deeply, but Mitchell's argument had merit. She needed something tangible, solid evidence that would unmask Daniels and his corrupt activities. But the path to uncovering such evidence seemed as elusive as a mirage. Where could she even start? And in the wake of recent events, how could she trust anyone within that precinct? The car raced along the deserted streets, city lights streaking past in a dazzling blur of color. Tara's gaze remained fixed out the window, her mind churning with possibilities. The thought of reaching out to her team at the FBI was crucial, but Daniels had seized her phone back at the precinct, leaving her cut off from any direct communication. Her frustration boiled over as her hands clenched into tight fists. It seemed like one setback after another. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. "Mitchell," she snapped, her voice laced with urgency. "We need to pull over. I need a phone." Mitchell's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. "We can't afford to stop now. It's too dangerous." Tara's jaw hardened as she struggled to control her rising irritation. "I can't proceed without coordinating with my team. If we're going to bring down Daniels, I need to be in touch with my people. I can't operate blindly." Mitchell's face betrayed his inner conflict as he weighed the risks. After a tense pause, he sighed in resignation. "There's a gas station a few miles ahead. We'll stop there so you can make your call. But we need to be quick. If Daniels is onto us, we're running out of time." Tara nodded, her mind already shifting into tactical mode. She knew precisely who to contact, an FBI colleague who owed her a favor and could be relied upon to act swiftly and discreetly. As they neared the gas station, Mitchell maneuvered the car into the dimly lit parking lot, positioning it near a secluded corner. Tara's instincts were on high alert. Every detail was crucial. She exited the vehicle, her eyes scanning the seemingly abandoned lot with heightened vigilance. Mistakes were no longer an option. Every moment was critical. With deliberate steps, she approached the payphone stationed under a flickering light. Mitchell remained in the car, his eyes darting about, ever watchful. Tara picked up the receiver, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she dialed the number she had memorized, her heart pounding in her chest. The phone rang, each chime echoing her mounting anxiety. Finally, a familiar voice crackled through the line. "Tara? Is that you?" Tara's grip tightened on the receiver as Agent Jackson's voice reached her ears. Relief mingled with the urgency of the situation. Every second ticked by, heightening the risk of Daniels tracking them down. "Yes, it's me," Tara whispered urgently. "I'm in serious trouble and need your help. Daniels is corrupt. He detained me without cause, and now he's scrambling to cover his tracks." There was a pause, and Tara could almost hear Agent Jackson's steadying breath on the other end. "All right, stay calm. Where are you?" "I'm at a gas station on the edge of town. I managed to escape with Mitchell's help, but I don't know how long we have before Daniels realizes I'm missing. He's dangerous, Jackson. We need to act fast." Jackson's voice took on a serious, almost urgent tone. "All right, listen closely. We're going to send backup as quickly as we can, but you need to stay out of sight and keep a low profile until we get there. Do you have any confidence in this Mitchell guy?" Tara threw a glance at Mitchell, who was nervously tapping his fingers against the steering wheel while his eyes darted around the dark, empty parking lot. The anxiety was clear on his face. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure," she admitted with a note of uncertainty. "But he did manage to get me out of that precinct, and right now, he's the only person I've got on my side." Jackson sighed heavily, a sound laden with both frustration and worry. "All right, I'm going to make some calls and get a team to your location as soon as possible. But you need to stay vigilant. Daniels is not someone who will give up easily. If he realizes you're working against him, things could get extremely dangerous." Tara nodded, though Jackson couldn't see the gesture through the phone. "Understood. I'll keep moving and stay cautious until backup arrives. Please don't let me down, Jackson." "You know I won't," Jackson reassured her firmly. "Just stay safe out there, Tara." As the call ended and the line went dead, Tara stared at the phone in her hand, her mind racing with a flurry of thoughts. She felt a surge of determination amid the chaos. While she knew she wasn't out of danger yet, she now had a plan. Backup was on its way, and with Jackson's assistance, they had a fighting chance to finally bring Daniels to justice. With a renewed sense of purpose, Tara hurried back to the car and slipped into the passenger seat. Mitchell glanced at her, his brow furrowed in concern, clearly sensing the weight of the situation. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of worry and urgency. "For now," Tara replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I've made the call. My team is sending backup, but we can't afford to linger here. Daniels will be searching for us, and it won't take long for him to realize I'm missing." Mitchell nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He shifted the car into gear and pulled out of the gas station, merging back onto the road with practiced precision. The city's bright lights soon faded into the distance as they drove. The streets grew narrower and the illumination from streetlights became sparse. Mitchell seemed to be taking them on a route deliberately designed to avoid detection. Tara could sense the urgency in his driving, knowing it was a matter of time before Daniels would catch on to their disappearance. She could already imagine the entire precinct mobilizing in search of them. After what felt like an eternity, Mitchell guided the car into a small, secluded parking lot on the outskirts of a dense forest. The area was eerily quiet, with only a few distant, dimly lit buildings scattered in the distance. He cut the engine and turned to Tara, his face reflecting a mix of determination and concern. "We'll wait here until your team arrives," Mitchell said quietly. "This place is remote and off the beaten path. Daniels probably won't think to look here immediately, at least not until he's exhausted other options." Tara looked around at their surroundings, taking in the isolation of their location. It wasn't the most comfortable or reassuring place, but it was far from the immediate danger of Daniel's reach. "Thanks, Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying a note of gratitude. "I know it's not ideal, but it's a start. We need to stay on alert." Mitchell gave a curt nod, his eyes scanning the perimeter of their temporary refuge. "We'll stay alert," he agreed, "but we should try to keep a low profile and be ready to move if necessary." Tara took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had bought themselves some time, but she knew that their fight was far from over. Daniels was still out there, and he would be relentless in his pursuit. Yet, with backup on the way and Mitchell's help, she felt a renewed sense of hope. She was determined to see this through to the end, no matter how perilous the journey ahead might be. Tara scanned the empty lot with a practiced eye, her senses alert to every subtle change in the environment. The shadows seemed to twist and elongate with every flicker of the distant streetlights, creating a disorienting dance of darkness. The profound silence amplified her growing unease, each sound outside. The rustling leaves, the occasional chirp of a nocturnal creature, felt unnervingly loud in the quiet. Despite the unsettling ambience, this was their best option for the moment. She gave a small, resolute nod and leaned back in her seat, though her mind was a whirlwind of anxiety and anticipation. They were safe, at least temporarily, but the danger was far from dissipating. Daniels was relentless and would not rest until he had what he desired. That meant Tara and Mitchell had to remain perpetually vigilant, always a step ahead. Mitchell, seated beside her, shifted restlessly, his eyes flitting nervously toward the encroaching darkness of the surrounding woods. "We need to keep quiet," he murmured with a trace of urgency in his voice. "If anyone's tracking us, making any noise could tip them off." Tara nodded in agreement. The stakes were too high for them to risk being discovered now. As they sat in the car, time seemed to stretch interminably. The stillness of the night rendered every minor sound outside, whether it was the whispering of the wind or the distant rumble of traffic, strikingly pronounced and almost oppressive. Her thoughts drifted to the imminent arrival of Jackson's team. She couldn't afford to remain hidden indefinitely. Taking decisive action was imperative to ensure Daniels faced justice for his extensive corruption. But to do that, she needed more than just temporary safety and additional support. She needed irrefutable evidence. Proof that would unequivocally expose Daniels as the corrupt cop he truly was. The only noise breaking the oppressive silence was the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. Tara and Mitchell sat in the dimly lit parking lot, the weak glow from the dashboard casting eerie shadows on their faces. Each passing minute seemed to grow heavier with the weight of their predicament. Mitchell's anxious glances, from the rearview mirror to the side windows, betrayed his unease as he scanned for any sign of headlights approaching through the darkness. Noticing his growing anxiety, Tara couldn't entirely blame him. They were evading a man wielding unchecked power, a man so invested in protecting his secrets that he was willing to go to any lengths. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this," Mitchell said, breaking the silence with a note of disbelief in his voice. "Daniels has always been underhanded, but I never imagined he'd take it this far." Tara turned to him, her voice calm yet imbued with a steely resolve. "Daniels isn't just underhanded. He's a master of intimidation and control. But his time is running out, and I intend to ensure that happens sooner rather than later." Mitchell gave a hesitant nod, but his doubt was evident. "I understand your determination, but remember, Daniels has the entire department in his grip. Most of them are too terrified to speak out. They know what happens to anyone who crosses him." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 5 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Tara exhaled slowly, acknowledging the fear that Daniels instilled in people. She had witnessed his tyranny firsthand, his behavior a constant reminder of his power and ruthlessness. But this wasn't merely about overcoming fear, it was about achieving justice. Daniels had pushed boundaries too far, and now he was targeting her to cover his tracks. She was resolute in her mission to hold him accountable. "What we need is solid evidence," Tara said, her thoughts crystallizing into a clear objective. "We need something undeniable, something that can't be dismissed as mere hearsay." Mitchell's expression darkened, as he considered the enormity of their task. "That's easier said than done. Daniels is meticulous. He covers his tracks with great care, and no one at the precinct is going to assist us. They're all terrified of what he might do if they talk." Tara's mind raced with possibilities. Mitchell was right. Taking down Daniels was going to be a formidable challenge, especially with most officers either complicit or too frightened to confront him. But she was convinced there had to be a way. Daniels had been corrupt for too long, and even the most cunning criminals make mistakes eventually. It was a matter of identifying the right leverage. "There has to be something," she said, more to herself than to Mitchell. "A paper trail, an eyewitness, anything." Mitchell fell silent, his gaze fixed on the windshield as the tension in the car became almost tangible. For a moment, both were lost in their thoughts, enveloped in the quiet of the night. Suddenly, Tara's phone buzzed, jolting her from her reverie. She fumbled to grab it, her heart racing as the screen illuminated with a message from Jackson. The brief but reassuring note read, "Backup is 15 minutes away. Stay put." Relief washed over Tara, but it was fleeting. Daniels was unyielding, and she was just as determined. Though backup was on its way, an unsettling feeling gnawed at her, signaling that things were about to intensify. "Backup's on the way," Tara said, her voice steady yet edged with urgency. "We need to stay low until they get here." Mitchell nodded, though the tension in his posture betrayed his unease. "I hope they arrive before Daniels does." Tara didn't respond. Mitchell's concern was well placed. She knew Daniels wasn't the type to stand idly by while she made her escape. To him, she was a significant threat that needed to be eradicated, and he wouldn't rest until she was silenced permanently. The tranquil night outside was suddenly pierced by the distant rumble of an engine. Mitchell's eyes widened, and he quickly checked the side mirror. "You hear that?" he whispered, his voice tight with apprehension. Tara tensed, straining her ears to catch the sound. The engine noise grew louder, and her stomach tightened with anxiety. Was it their backup arriving, or had Daniels already tracked them down? Mitchell leaned forward, peering into the enveloping darkness. "I don't like this," he muttered. "We're too exposed out here." Tara's heartbeat quickened as she scanned the darkness for any signs of danger. The engine noise continued to increase, and her mind raced with grim possibilities. If Daniels had caught up with them, there was no predicting his next move. "We need to move," Mitchell said urgently, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life, and Tara's heart raced in sync with the revving of the car. They couldn't afford to wait around and find out who was approaching. Mitchell slammed his foot on the accelerator, and the car surged forward, screeching out of the parking lot and onto the narrow road. Tara glanced anxiously over her shoulder, scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. Her hands clenched into tight fists, her thoughts a frantic prayer for backup to arrive quickly. As they hurtled down the deserted road, Tara's mind was a whirlwind of fear and urgency. Daniels was closing in, and the sense of impending disaster was overwhelming. Mitchell veered onto a side road, the car bouncing violently over the uneven pavement. They were now deep in the rural outskirts, enveloped by thick woods and an oppressive silence. Tara's gaze darted between the rearview mirror and the dark road ahead, her anxiety palpable. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, her voice strained. "We're heading into the middle of nowhere." Mitchell's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white as he fought to keep control. "It's better this way," he said, though his tone was laced with uncertainty. Tara wasn't entirely convinced, but she knew their options were limited. They needed to buy time until Jackson's team arrived, and staying on the move was their best chance to avoid being trapped by Daniels. As they plunged deeper into the woods, the road became increasingly treacherous. The car jolted over potholes and cracked pavement, and Tara clung to the door, desperately trying to maintain her balance. Suddenly, the ominous rumble of another vehicle pierced the night, causing Tara's heart to leap into her throat. She turned to Mitchell, her eyes wide with dread. "He's found us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mitchell's face drained of color, and without a word, he pressed harder on the gas pedal. The car surged forward, speeding down the darkened road as Tara's pulse pounded in her ears. The headlights of the approaching vehicle grew nearer, closing the distance with alarming speed. "Pull over," Mitchell muttered, his voice trembling with fear. He swerved the car onto an even narrower road, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The headlights behind them were closing in, and Tara knew their window of escape was rapidly closing. The car veered erratically as they raced down the cramped road, and Tara's heart raced as she gripped her seat, praying they could outdistance their pursuer. Mitchell's hands gripped the wheel with white-knuckled intensity as the road twisted and turned through the dense forest. The headlights of the vehicle behind them illuminated the trees, casting long, menacing shadows that flickered across their path. Tara's heart pounded as the car lurched over uneven terrain, the tires struggling to maintain traction on the worn-out pavement. "Whoever that is, they're not giving up," Mitchell muttered, his voice tight with barely concealed fear. His eyes flickered nervously to the rearview mirror, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Tara, her heart pounding in her chest, stole a glance at the side mirror. The car tailing them had closed insignificantly, its headlights slicing through the darkness like twin harbingers of doom. They seemed to grow more menacing with every passing second, casting an oppressive glow that threatened to engulf them. Though the driver's identity remained hidden, Tara knew without a doubt who was behind the wheel: Daniels, relentless and unyielding. "We can't let him catch us, not now," Tara said through gritted teeth, her gaze flitting between the encroaching headlights and the narrow road ahead. Mitchell's face was a mask of grim determination as he pushed the accelerator to its limits. The engine roared in protest, its growl mingling with the shrill squeal of the tires as they navigated the treacherous winding road. The trees seemed to crowd in on them, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the road appeared to narrow with every curve. "We're going to lose him," Mitchell said, though his voice lacked conviction, sounding more like an attempt to reassure himself than a statement of fact. Tara was less optimistic. Daniels had already demonstrated a ruthless commitment to achieving his goals, and those goals were centered squarely on her. The weight of Daniels' obsession was like a suffocating shroud, a constant, oppressive presence. He wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was a man driven by a need for dominance and control. Right now, she was the obstacle standing between him and his desires. Suddenly, the road ahead split into two divergent paths. Mitchell made a hasty decision, veering sharply to the left. The car lurched violently, and Tara clutched the dashboard to steady herself. For a fleeting moment, the pursuing headlights disappeared, only to reappear, now following their new route. "Damn it!" Mitchell cursed under his breath, his frustration palpable. "He's still on us." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 6 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Tara's mind raced, desperately searching for a viable plan. They couldn't outrun Daniels indefinitely, not on these isolated back roads. They needed to come up with a strategy, and they needed it fast. "We can't just keep driving," Tara said urgently, her voice tight with desperation. "He'll catch us eventually. We need to come up with a plan." Mitchell shot her a troubled glance, his jaw clenched as he grappled with their grim situation. "What do you suggest? We're stranded in the middle of nowhere." Tara's eyes darted to the darkened forest flanking the road. The trees, densely packed and ominous, offered a less than ideal refuge, but seemed to be their only option. "Pull over," she commanded, her voice resolute despite her fear. "We'll ditch the car and head into the woods." Mitchell shot her a dubious look. "Into the woods? Are you serious?" Tara's heart raced as she nodded, her pulse thundering in her ears. "It's our best shot. Daniels won't be able to follow us through the trees. We can lose him." Mitchell hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously to the rearview mirror where the lights of the pursuing vehicle grew ever closer. After a tense moment, he nodded. "All right, let's do it." With a sharp turn of the wheel, Mitchell skidded the car to the side of the road, coming to a screeching halt just as the headlights of the following vehicle loomed large behind them. Without wasting a second, Tara flung open the passenger door and leaped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot punctuating their desperate flight. Mitchell was right behind her, slamming his door shut and joining her as they sprinted toward the dark, foreboding line of trees. The forest ahead was an impenetrable expanse of shadow, but there was no time to hesitate. They needed to disappear, and quickly. The sound of the pursuing car coming to a halt echoed ominously through the night, spurring Tara's pace to a frantic sprint. "Come on," she whispered urgently, grabbing Mitchell's arm and pulling him into the cover of the trees. The canopy overhead was thick with branches that blocked out nearly all light, plunging them into near-total darkness. The uneven ground was a treacherous obstacle, the underbrush snagging at their legs and making every step a struggle. But Tara didn't let up. The distant sounds of car doors slamming and the crunch of boots on gravel signaled Daniel's imminent arrival. Mitchell stumbled behind her, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, his panic palpable. Despite his struggle to keep up, Tara knew they had no choice but to keep moving. The forest's dark embrace was their only hope for evasion. "We need to keep moving," Tara whispered urgently, her voice barely more than a strained murmur. She glanced anxiously over her shoulder, her heart pounding with every sound. "If he finds us," her voice trailed off, the ominous silence speaking volumes. Both Tara and Mitchell understood all too well what would happen if Daniels caught up with them. They had seen his ruthless capabilities firsthand, and the memory of his cold, calculated brutality was still fresh in their minds. The fear of experiencing it again was almost unbearable. The sound of footsteps grew louder, each one echoing with a menacing rhythm that tightened Tara's stomach with a vice-like grip. Daniels was getting closer, and the sense of impending doom was overwhelming. They had to find a way out of this situation, or at the very least, a place to hide where they could regroup and plan their next move. "Over here," Mitchell's voice was a rough whisper as he grabbed Tara's arm and pointed towards a dense cluster of bushes ahead. His eyes were wide with fear, his expression grim. Tara didn't need any further encouragement. Without a second thought, she ducked behind the protective cover of the bushes, pulling Mitchell with her. The branches scratched at her skin, their sharp edges digging into her flesh, but she hardly noticed. Her entire focus was on the approaching footsteps, each one sending waves of dread crashing through her body. They crouched in the shadowy refuge of the bushes, their breaths coming in shallow, synchronized gasps. The sound of footsteps grew louder and more distinct, a harsh reminder of the danger they were facing. Every minute seemed to stretch into an eternity as they waited in tense silence, barely daring to breathe. Tara's heart raced in her chest, each beat a frantic reminder of their precarious situation. She could only hope that the darkness would be enough to conceal them from Daniel's searching eyes. The footsteps continued to draw nearer, and Tara's anxiety mounted with every passing second. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped abruptly. Tara's breath caught in her throat, her entire body going rigid with fear. The stillness that followed was almost unbearable, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves under someone's boots. She could feel the presence of the person just a few feet away, their proximity palpable. Panic surged through her mind. What if Daniels had discovered their hiding place? What if he knew exactly where they were? Beside her, Mitchell trembled, his fear a tangible force that seemed to amplify Tara's own. For what felt like an eternity, they remained motionless, their eyes straining to catch any sign of movement. Then, just as abruptly as they had stopped, the footsteps began again, this time moving away from their location. Tara let out a shaky breath, a wave of relief flooding through her as she realized that Daniels was heading in the opposite direction. "He's going the other way," Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with the same relief that Tara felt. Tara nodded, though her body remained taut with tension. Daniels might have moved on for now, but she knew that this reprieve was only temporary. They were far from safe. "We can't stay here," Tara whispered, her eyes darting around the darkness, searching for any signs of danger. "We need to keep moving." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Then he nodded, and together they began to rise from their hiding spot. As they made their way deeper into the woods, their movements were cautious and deliberate, every step calculated to avoid making any unnecessary noise. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the darkness closing in like a suffocating blanket. Their breaths were shallow and quick, their bodies tense with the strain of continued flight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the occasional rustle of foliage or the distant hoot of an owl was a stark reminder of their isolation. Despite their temporary escape from Daniels, Tara could not shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The trees seemed to press in on them as they moved further away from the road. Their once familiar surroundings now transformed into a maze of tangled branches and underbrush. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and hidden pitfalls that made every step a challenge. Tara's legs ached with fatigue, but she pushed herself to keep going, driven by the relentless need to stay one step ahead of their pursuer. Mitchell stumbled beside her, his face pale and drawn, the fear etched deeply into his features. He struggled to keep up, his movements slow and unsteady. Tara reached out to steady him, offering what comfort she could while maintaining their brisk pace. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, each snap of a twig or rustle of leaves heightening their sense of vulnerability. The night seemed endless, a dark expanse that stretched on with no clear end in sight. With each step they took, the weight of Daniel's pursuit loomed over them like an ever-present storm cloud. Tara knew that they couldn't run forever, but for now, all they could do was keep moving, hoping that their efforts would buy them enough time to find safety. The faint moonlight filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting a ghostly luminescence over their precarious path. The uneven ground beneath them seemed to shift with every step, and Mitchell's heavy, labored breathing was a clear sign of his struggle to keep pace. Tara, ever the observer, noticed his exhaustion and slowed her pace, glancing at him with mounting concern. "You okay?" she whispered, her voice barely penetrating the stillness of the night. Mitchell's response was a strained nod, his face set in a grimace of fatigue. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just trying to catch my breath." Tara was keenly aware of his exhaustion but knew they couldn't afford to stop, not while Daniels was still out there, relentless in his pursuit. Every minute they spent resting could potentially put them at greater risk. "We need to keep moving," Tara said softly, her eyes darting around the encroaching darkness. "We need to find somewhere secure to hide until we can figure out our next steps." Mitchell didn't protest. He simply nodded and continued, his movements slower and more labored. Tara's mind was a whirlwind of strategies and concerns as they pushed forward. They couldn't stay in the forest forever, and returning to the road wasn't an option. Daniels would undoubtedly be waiting for them there, more determined than ever. Suddenly, Mitchell halted abruptly, his hand grasping Tara's arm with unexpected urgency. Tara's heart leaped into her throat as she turned to him, anxiety flooding her senses. "What is it?" she whispered urgently, her voice tight with tension. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 7 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Mitchell's eyes were wide with alarm as he pointed ahead, his gesture sharp and deliberate. Tara followed his gaze, straining to see through the oppressive darkness. At first, the night seemed impenetrable, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight, she began to make out the silhouette of a building in the distance. It was an old, weather-beaten cabin, its wooden frame barely visible amidst the thick, encroaching trees. The cabin's windows were dark, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. It looked forlorn and abandoned, but in their current predicament, it represented a potential refuge, a place where they might regroup and plan their next move. "Come on," Tara said quietly, her grip firm on Mitchell's arm. "Let's check it out." They advanced cautiously toward the cabin, their footfalls muffled by the thick carpet of leaves and undergrowth. Tara's senses were on high alert as they approached. Despite its seemingly abandoned state, she was acutely aware of the potential danger. Daniels could be anywhere, and the last thing they needed was to walk into a trap. They reached the front of the cabin, and Tara tested the door with a careful push. It groaned loudly on its hinges as it swung open, the sound unsettling in the quiet night. Tara winced at the noise, but quickly pushed the door open wider, signaling for Mitchell to follow her inside. The interior of the cabin matched the exterior in its state of disrepair. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs draped like shrouds from the corners of the ceiling. The furniture, what little there was in a sorry state. A few old chairs with splintered wood and a table that looked on the verge of collapse. A musty, stagnant odor filled the air, and the floorboards creaked ominously under their weight as they stepped inside. Tara closed the door behind them with a cautious click, her eyes scanning the dimly lit interior for anything that could be of use. The cabin was far from ideal, its decrepit state offering little comfort or security, but it provided walls and a roof, which was a small blessing in their current situation. "We can stay here for a bit," Tara said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "It's not perfect, but it's a place to rest and figure out what we do next." Mitchell sank into one of the broken chairs with a weary sigh, wiping sweat from his brow. Despite the cool night air, his face was slick with perspiration. "This place gives me the creeps," Mitchell muttered, casting nervous glances around the room. "But I guess it's better than being out there." Tara agreed, though she couldn't shake the persistent feeling of unease. The cabin felt too quiet, its stillness almost oppressive. Her instincts urged her to remain vigilant, but she didn't want to heighten Mitchell's anxiety further. He was already on edge, and the last thing they needed was for fear to dominate their thoughts. "We'll be fine," Tara said, striving to project confidence. "We just need to rest for a bit, then we'll figure out our next move." Mitchell nodded, but his face remained etched with skepticism. Tara couldn't blame him. Everything about their situation felt deeply unsettling. They were always a step behind, struggling to stay ahead of Daniels. Each decision seemed to bring new challenges, and the weight of their predicament hung heavily over them. As they settled into the dilapidated cabin, Tara's mind was already racing, plotting their next move. She knew that time was of the essence, and they needed to use every minute wisely. For now, though, their immediate concern was to stay alert and make the most of the temporary shelter they had found. Tara approached one of the grimy windows, carefully drawing back the tattered curtain just enough to peer outside. The forest loomed before them, shrouded in darkness and menace. She could make out nothing in the murky depths, but that didn't mean Daniels wasn't lurking somewhere out there. "We need to leave soon," she murmured, her voice almost lost in the quiet of the cabin. Her words were as much for her benefit as for Mitchell's. "We can't stay here for long." Mitchell glanced up from where he was crouched on an old wooden chair, his face etched with fatigue, but his eyes steely with resolve. "What's the plan? We can't just keep running forever." Tara let the curtain fall back into place with a heavy sigh. "I don't have a solid plan yet, but going back to the road isn't an option. Daniels will be waiting for us there." Mitchell's frown deepened as he considered their predicament. "What if we try reaching the nearest town? There has to be one around here." Tara shook her head, her frustration evident. "It's too risky. If Daniels catches us before we get there, we're finished." An uneasy silence settled between them as they both weighed their options. Tara's mind raced through possible escape routes and contingencies, but every idea seemed fraught with danger. The thought of another confrontation with Daniels made her stomach churn with dread. The sudden snap of a twig outside shattered the quiet, jolting Tara's heart into overdrive. She and Mitchell exchanged a swift, panicked glance, their fear palpable. "Did you hear that?" Mitchell's whisper was barely audible, his voice trembling. Tara nodded, her body tensing as she strained to hear. There was no mistaking it. The sound of footsteps, measured and deliberate, echoed through the trees surrounding the cabin. Daniels had found them. Pressing her back against the wall of the cabin, Tara tried to steady her breathing. Each creak and rustle from outside heightened her sense of impending doom. She gestured urgently for Mitchell to remain silent, her finger pressed to her lips. His eyes were wide with terror, but he nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. The footsteps grew louder, more pronounced. Whoever was out there wasn't attempting to conceal their presence. It was as if they were fully aware of Tara and Mitchell's location and were deliberately taking their time to reach them. Tara's mind raced with grim scenarios of what Daniels might do if he caught them. His previous actions had made it clear that he was willing to use extreme measures to eliminate any threat, and she had no doubt he would do whatever it took to ensure their silence. Tara's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a drum of anxious anticipation. She knew they had to act fast, but in the encroaching darkness and mounting fear, every decision seemed fraught with peril. Tara's hand instinctively slid to her waistband, where her FBI-issued firearm was concealed. Amidst the pandemonium of their flight, she had nearly forgotten about it. Although she preferred to avoid violence whenever possible, she knew that if the situation demanded it, if it came down to protecting herself or Mitchell, she would use it without hesitation. The sound of heavy footsteps abruptly halted just outside the cabin door. Tara held her breath, her body taut with tension, as she waited for the intruder's next move. The minutes felt like hours, the silence stretching unbearably until it was shattered by a resounding bang. The door was flung open with such force that it crashed against the wall, making the entire cabin shudder under the impact. Tara's heart skipped a beat as she and Mitchell pressed themselves flat against the wall, striving to stay hidden. The rhythmic, heavy thuds of boots advancing into the cabin were ominous and methodical, each step reverberating through the silent room. Her pulse raced, each thump of her heart urging her to run, but the cabin offered no clear escape. They were trapped, the walls closing in on them both physically and psychologically. "Tara!" Mitchell's voice emerged as a strained whisper, his face pale and etched with fear. "What do we do?" Tara shook her head, her eyes locked with his in a silent command. She tightened her grip around the firearm's handle, her fingers trembling slightly, but her resolve unwavering. "Stay quiet," she mouthed, her lips forming the words with deliberate clarity. "Don't move." The figure in the doorway paused momentarily, casting a long shadow across the room as he surveyed the space with deliberate slowness. Tara could hear the shallow, uneven breathing that marked his presence. Her instinct screamed that it was Daniel's. She had seen his face and heard his voice enough times to recognize him instantly. But why was he moving so deliberately? Was he reveling in their fear, savoring the hunt like a predator relishing the chase? Come out, wherever you are," Daniel's voice echoed through the cabin, laden with sadistic pleasure. "You can't hide forever, Agent Lawson." A chill ran down Tara's spine at the sound of his voice, the cruel taunt sending shivers of dread through her. He knew she was there, and his intent was clear. He was not merely searching. He was taunting, relishing the power he held over them. The time for hiding was over. With every nerve in her body screaming for action, Tara began to edge toward the corner, her back still pressed firmly against the wall. She drew her gun, keeping it concealed behind her leg, her movements slow and calculated. She needed to remain composed and strategic, to outthink Daniels rather than merely react. Mitchell's breathing grew heavier and more ragged, his fear almost tangible. Tara sensed his rising panic and glanced at him, offering a reassuring squeeze on his arm. They had to stay strong. Giving in to their fear would be their undoing. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 8 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Daniel stepped further into the cabin, his flashlight beam sweeping the room with methodical precision. The light cut through the stagnant air, illuminating particles of dust that danced like specters in the beam. His voice carried a menacing edge as he spoke, his words dripping with disdain. "You thought you could run from me," he said, the tone almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than hunting them down. "You thought you could evade justice after what you've done?" Tara's mind raced, struggling to decode his accusation. What was he referring to? She had been diligently investigating her case, working within the bounds of her duty. Yet here she was, pursued like a fugitive. The disconnect between her actions and his rage was disorienting. "I know you're in here," Daniels continued, his voice rising, laden with threats. "I can smell your fear. Why don't you make this easy on yourself and come out? You know this isn't going to end well for you." The weight of the firearm in her hand was a small comfort, a reminder that she had some measure of control in this nightmarish situation. But she had to be cautious. One false move could set off a chain of events that might end disastrously. Tara cautiously peeked around the corner, just enough to catch a glimpse of Daniels. He stood in the middle of the room, his presence imposing and cold. The flashlight's beam cut through the dust-filled air, highlighting his emotionless expression. He moved with an eerie calmness, as if this were just another routine operation rather than a life-threatening encounter with a fellow law enforcement officer. The indifference in his demeanor was unsettling, adding another layer of terror to the already harrowing situation. Tara's mind whirled with a torrent of strategies and possibilities, each more urgent than the last. Confronting Daniels head-on and trying to de-escalate the situation with her FBI credentials seemed like the rational approach. However, the cold reality hit her that Daniels had already dismissed her authority, relishing the power he wielded over her. His earlier actions had made it clear that he had no respect for her, not as an agent and certainly not as an individual. The prospect of trying to reason with him seemed increasingly futile and dangerous. Her frantic thoughts were abruptly shattered by the sound of Mitchell shifting beside her. His foot brushed against a loose floorboard, creating a faint creak that, in the oppressive silence of the cabin, was amplified into a sharp, alarming noise. The momentary disturbance was enough to draw Daniels' attention. What was that? Daniels' voice cut through the silence like a knife, his head snapping around toward the noise. The realization that they had been discovered struck Tara with the force of a punch. There was no more time to hide or strategize. Action was required immediately to prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control. Taking a deep breath to steady her racing heart, Tara stepped out from behind the wall, her gun still concealed at her side. She knew that revealing it might escalate the situation, so she chose to maintain her position for now. "Daniels," she called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "It's over. You need to stop this." Daniels' eyes widened momentarily in surprise, but his initial shock quickly gave way to a dark, menacing intensity. "Tara Lawson," he said, his voice low and dripping with menace. "I knew you'd eventually show yourself." Tara raised her free hand in a gesture of calm, her attempt to de-escalate the situation evident in her posture. "This doesn't have to go any further. Let's just talk." "Talk? Talk?" Daniels' voice was scathing as he took a deliberate step toward her. "You think I'm interested in talking after everything you've done?" Tara's confusion deepened as she tried to comprehend Daniels' words. "What are you talking about, Daniels? What did I do?" Daniels' sneer widened, his grip tightening around the baton he held with a menacing resolve. "You think you can just come into my town and dig into things that don't concern you? You think you can poke around in my business and expect to walk away unscathed?" Tara's eyes narrowed as understanding dawned. This wasn't just a routine stop or a simple misunderstanding. Daniels had something to hide, and her investigation had threatened to expose it. His aggressive reaction was rooted in his desperation to protect whatever secrets he was hiding. "I was just doing my job," Tara said, her voice firm and unwavering. "You can't keep running from this. Sooner or later, the truth will come out." Daniels' face twisted into a mask of rage, his anger palpable and almost tangible. For a moment, Tara feared he might attack her outright, but instead, he took a deep breath, his expression shifting back to a cold, calculating glare. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Agent Lawson," he said quietly, his voice a chilling promise. "But you will soon enough." Before Tara could react or even process his threat, Daniels lunged at her, his baton raised high in a brutal swing. Reacting on sheer instinct, Tara ducked, narrowly avoiding the impact. She spun around, her gun now fully drawn. But before she could aim, Daniels grabbed her wrist with a vice-like grip. He twisted it painfully, forcing the gun from her hand. It fell to the floor with a clatter, out of reach and useless. Mitchell, seeing Tara's predicament, shouted in alarm and rushed toward Daniels, desperation evident in his movements. But Daniels was too quick and too ruthless. In a swift, practiced motion, he shoved Tara to the ground, sending her sprawling. The force of the impact left her stunned and disoriented. The dim light of the cabin flickered erratically, casting ominous shadows that danced across the walls as Tara struggled to regain her composure. Mitchell stood nearby, his hands raised defensively, his face pale with fear as he tried to shield himself from Daniels' threatening presence. The cabin's oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around them, heightening their sense of vulnerability. As Tara lay on the floor, She felt a wave of weakness and frustration. Daniels had taken away her gun, but her training and quick thinking were still her greatest assets. She couldn't afford to let fear or anger paralyze her. With a burst of adrenaline, Tara rolled away from Daniels, creating some much-needed distance. Her heart raced as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes scanning the room for any potential weapons or tools that could aid in their escape. Daniels, momentarily surprised by Tara's resilience and agility, let out a frustrated growl. "You're a tough one, aren't you? But this ends now." His voice was laced with a deadly certainty, and the menace in his tone was unmistakable. The stakes were higher than ever, and Tara knew that her survival depended on her ability to stay calm, think quickly, and use every resource at her disposal. As she assessed the room, her mind raced with possible strategies, her resolve hardening against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Tara's sharp gaze caught Mitchell's frantic glances darting between her and Daniels. His fear was palpable, yet his mind was racing, trying to devise a way to assist. Tara couldn't afford to let him deliberate any longer. She had to take decisive action. The advancing Daniels was a menacing threat, and Tara's only chance was to act before he could close in on her. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 9 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. In a swift sweep of her surroundings, Tara's eyes locked onto a heavy metal pipe resting in a shadowy corner of the cabin. It wasn't a perfect weapon, but it was better than nothing. She sprinted toward it with urgent determination, her breath quickening as she grabbed the pipe just as Daniels lunged in her direction once more. With a powerful, well-aimed swing, Tara managed to knock Daniels back, buying herself a few crucial moments to strategize. Daniels stumbled from the force of the blow, but regained his balance with impressive speed, his face contorted with fury. "You think a pipe is going to stop me? You've got another thing coming," he growled, his voice dripping with scorn. Despite his fierce demeanor, Tara observed a flicker of uncertainty in Daniels' movements. His confidence was wavering, perhaps realizing that she was not as easily subdued as he had anticipated. Tara seized this fleeting advantage, her mind whirling through possible tactics. "Mitchell, stay back." Tara's voice rang out with a commanding urgency. "I need you to stay out of this. Find help." Mitchell paused, clearly torn between the impulse to stay and assist or to escape. But Tara's unwavering resolve and the intensity in her eyes compelled him. With a determined nod, he dashed toward the door, disappearing into the enveloping darkness of the night. As the door slammed shut behind him, Tara's attention snapped back to Daniels. His recovery from the blow was swift, and his fury seemed to escalate with each passing second. Tara realized she needed to exploit his rage. If she could make him underestimate her, she might find an opportunity to shift the balance of power. As Daniels advanced once more, Tara's movements were strategic and precise. She used the pipe to keep him at a distance, her defensive swings expertly calculated. Her training had prepared her for confrontations, but dealing with someone as unhinged as Daniels required a different level of focus. "Why are you doing this, Daniels?" Tara's voice cut through the chaos, firm despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "What's your endgame?" Daniel's face twisted in a mask of hatred, his response laced with venom. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you? You FBI agents. You think you can waltz into my town and dig into things that don't concern you. You think you're above everyone else?" The hatred in his eyes was unmistakable, and it was clear that Tara's investigation had struck a nerve, revealing something he was desperate to conceal. But there was no time for discourse. Tara needed to remain focused on the immediate threat. As Daniels lunged again, Tara was ready. She deftly sidestepped his attack and swung the pipe with precision, striking his arm. Daniels roared in pain, clutching his injured arm as he staggered back. Tara moved swiftly, seizing the chance to disarm him. With a precise strike, she sent the baton flying from Daniels's grasp, watching it skid across the floor. Tara reached for the baton, but Daniels, undeterred by his injury, lunged at her with a renewed sense of desperation. Just as he was about to reach her, the distant wail of approaching sirens pierced the night air. Tara's heart leaped with a surge of hope. Assistance was on its way. The sirens grew louder, and Daniel's face shifted from rage to panic. The realization that time was running out was etched clearly across his features. "You're finished, Daniels," Tara declared with unwavering authority, her voice cutting through the tension. "The police are on their way." Daniels paused, his gaze shifting nervously toward the door, the brief flicker of panic evident in his eyes. For a split second, it seemed he might attempt a desperate escape. However, he quickly composed himself, his face contorting into a scowl of unrestrained fury. "This isn't over," he growled, his tone dripping with menace. "You haven't heard the last of me." Before Tara could react, Daniels whirled around and dashed toward the back door of the cabin, vanishing into the enveloping darkness of the night. Tara wasted no time. She grabbed the baton lying nearby and hurriedly checked on Mitchell. The rising wail of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second, and the glow of flashing lights pierced through the windows of the cabin. Tara exhaled deeply, her shoulders sagging with a mix of relief and exhaustion. As the first police cars screeched to a halt outside, their lights casting long shadows across the cabin's interior. Uniformed officers burst into the cabin, their faces etched with concern and determination. One of them, recognizing Tara, called out, "Agent Lawson, are you all right?" Tara nodded, her body trembling from a combination of fatigue and lingering adrenaline. "I'm okay, but we need to track down Daniels. He's armed and extremely dangerous." Without hesitation, the officers took charge, dispersing efficiently to begin their search for Daniels. Tara observed their coordinated efforts, noting their speed and professionalism. She was confident that Daniels wouldn't get far. The police were both skilled and well-prepared, and with Tara's detailed description, they had a solid chance of apprehending him quickly. As the search unfolded, Tara's thoughts inevitably drifted back to Mitchell. While he was safe now, the trauma of the ordeal would likely weigh heavily on him for a long time. Tara understood that tonight's events would be etched into both of their memories for years to come. The cabin, which had been a site of fear and peril, now felt like a temporary refuge, a place of brief respite amidst the chaos. Tara was grateful for the timely arrival of help, yet she was acutely aware that the confrontation was far from over. Daniels remained at large, and the quest for justice was just beginning. For the moment, Tara allowed herself a brief pause, taking a deep breath and savoring a fleeting sense of relief. The immediate threat had been mitigated, but the path to resolution and justice still lay ahead. We've delved into a powerful and deeply emotional scenario today, highlighting the intense personal and professional challenges faced by Special Agent Tara Johnson. This story sheds light on the harsh realities of discrimination and the courage required to confront it. So, what have you learned from Tara's harrowing experience? Take a moment to reflect on one key lesson you've gained from this video. How can you apply this lesson in your own life? We'd love to hear your thoughts and insights, so please leave a comment below sharing what stood out to you and how it might influence your actions. If you found this video impactful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and activate the bell icon so you never miss out on our latest content. Your support helps us bring more important stories and discussions to light. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to hearing from you in the comments.